Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Corrine Weintraub. I am the Western States Outreach Coordinator with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. Today's event is titled Tipping Points: How the Climate Will Change California's Water Future. We'll be hearing from two experts who will discuss how climate change will affect California's water and in turn our communities across the state, and what we can do now to plan for sustainability. So we'll begin with some brief introductions, but before we do, I'll quickly go over the ReadyTalk software that we're using today. So most of you will be viewing the presentation from your computer, and you'll be able to listen to the presentations directly through your computer. So just make sure your speakers are on. And if you're unable to use the audio through your computer, you can call the number on the screen to participate that way and get the audio through your phone. We encourage you to engage with our speakers throughout the presentation as well. So if you look to the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat box where you can comment at any point during the presentations to us. And this is also where you'll be able to submit questions. So longer questions will be saved for the Q&A at the end, and quick clarification questions will be addressed between talks. And then during the Q&A, we will check periodically to see if there are any questions from the phone. With that being said, I'll give a little background on all of today's speakers. So Dr. Juliet Christian-Smith is a senior climate scientist with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, based here in our Oakland office. Dr. Christian-Smith is the lead author of the book, A 21st Century U.S. Water Policy, and has written extensively on sustainable groundwater management, including the report Measuring What Matters. She has received the Environmental Protection Agency's Award for Outstanding Achievement and a Fulbright Fellowship. And this year she was named as a top expert to watch on California climate, energy, and water issues by News Deeply. Laurel Firestone co-founded and co-directs the Community Water Center. The Community Water Center acts as a catalyst for community-driven water solutions through organizing, education, and advocacy in California's San Joaquin Valley to ensure that all communities have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. She has authored numerous publications, including the comprehensive Guide to Community Drinking Water Advocacy. And this year she was listed as one of the 9 most influential people in California water policy by Environment and Energy Publishing. Now we're ready to begin the presentations, and we'll begin with Juliet.
Thanks, Corrine. And hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. In the water world, October marks the beginning of a new water year. And so this means that the 2016 drought year is officially over. It also means that speculation will now begin over whether the coming water year will be wet or dry. And so it seemed like a good time to look back on where we are after 5 years of drought, what we've learned, and where we need to go. As you all know, California is a global leader in addressing climate change pollution, recently passing SB 32 that sets enforceable greenhouse gas reduction targets of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, which is the level identified by the international scientific community to stave off the worst effects of climate change. And last year, the governor's executive order required state agencies to take climate change into account in their investment and planning decisions. But what you may not know is that when it comes to building a climate resilient water system, our state has barely even begun. This probably isn't a story you've read about or heard about on the news. In fact, you've probably heard a lot about short-lived weather systems like El Nino. Over the last year alone, the Los Angeles Times published over 175 stories with El Nino in the title. First with the hope that Godzilla storms would end California's drought, and then with disappointment. But here's what's not in the news. El Nino and its drier counterpart, La Nina, are nothing compared to the impacts of climate change, what we call La Madre of California water. Global warming is already changing our water system, and in the coming years, scientists expect a major shift in the way water needs to be managed throughout the western United States. I'm going to start off today describing some of the biophysical aspects of climate change on our water system, and then I'm going to turn it over to Laurel to discuss some of the social and economic impacts of prolonged drought conditions. And finally, we'll wrap it up describing some of the recent water victories and a couple of important policy decisions that we're currently tracking, and explain how to get involved. Up until now, most planners and project designers have relied on existing data and past experience to guide decisions. With climate change, we can no longer use the past to plan the future. We now need to rely on science and projections that include uncertainty and risk. In California, we're fortunate to have a wealth of studies examining the impacts of climate change. However, translating those data into policy-relevant information continues to be a challenge. And that's where the Union of Concerned Scientists comes in, acting as a bridge between science and policy. We have a network of over 17,000 scientists who we work with to craft policy-relevant messages and to inform our interventions in state and federal policymaking processes. This picture is showing two views of Lake Oroville, which is one of the largest reservoirs in the State Water Project system. The picture taken on the left was taken before the current drought began, and the picture on the right was taken in 2014 after 3 years of drought. California, along with many other western states, built a water storage system in the 20th century that was designed to capture winter snowmelt and then convey that water through a system of canals, pipes, and pumps to agricultural and urban water users during the summer. The science on how climate change will impact water tells us that assumptions about when, where, and how precipitation will fall are changing. We're going to see more rain and less snow in California, which means we'll need to rethink our historic strategy of relying on spring snowmelt to fill our reservoirs and provide surface water during the dry season months. Climate change represents a fundamental change to California's water system. And if we continue to emit similar amounts of greenhouse gases as we are currently, scientists project that we will see a loss of up to 80% of our snowpack by the end of this century. It's actually not that hard to imagine, as it's similar to what we've just experienced over the last few years. These pictures show the snow disappearing from Half Dome from 2012 through 2015. The statewide average temperature during the winter of 2014 to 2015 was the warmest ever recorded at slightly over 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's more than 5 degrees warmer than the average for the 20th century. And warming has been most evident in the Sierra Nevada, where much of our water supply originates as snow. In 2015, average minimum temperatures registered above freezing for the first time, which was related to the lowest ever recorded snowpack, also in 2015. A recent series of studies have shown that these increasing temperatures are responsible for worsening the severity of the current drought by about 25%. And over the last 2 decades, the number of water years that were characterized as not only dry but also hot doubled in comparison to the last century. What this means is that drought years now are dry and hot, and that increased temperatures exacerbate dry conditions, driving up evaporation, transpiration, and water demand. Essentially what we're doing is widening the gap between water demand and water supply. As the drought has reduced the water levels in reservoirs, rivers, and streams, what we call surface water, many water users have shifted to groundwater sources. And over half of our total water use in California came from groundwater during this drought, drawing down this critical reserve. You can see here that in just 1 year alone, groundwater levels declined by about 10 feet in much of the northern Central Valley and as much as 60 feet in the southern Central Valley. This has caused unprecedented levels of land subsidence, where land is actually sinking due to the loss of water pressure underground. And in areas with some of the greatest groundwater declines, there are schools and communities entirely dependent on groundwater for drinking water supply. Groundwater essentially serves as the state's water savings account, and it's been our buffer during dry times. As climate change continues to have significant impacts on our surface water supply, dwindling surface water supplies, we're witnessing what we call the big water supply shift, or a shift to the greater exploitation of groundwater. And these unsustainable levels of pumping are depleting this resource, and many areas are now in a condition known as groundwater overdraft, which simply means we're taking out more than we're returning to the account. As California increasingly turns to groundwater, the focus must shift to making groundwater more reliable and sustainable to ensure that there's enough water for current and future generations. Here at the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're working with our science network, our activists, and our allies to develop a vision for the future where groundwater is sustainably managed to be able to help us to respond to more severe floods and droughts in the future. In the meantime, the biophysical impacts of the current prolonged drought include lower reservoir levels and less surface water supply, which we've already discussed, plummeting native fish populations. The long-term decline of native fish populations has worsened during this drought. Scientists predict that if the drought drags on for another year or two, wild populations of some of the state's most prized fish, salmon and steelhead in particular, are likely to vanish. Depleted soil moisture means there's less soil water available to plants, and that's weakened forest ecosystems. In addition to lack of precipitation and high temperature, tree mortality has increased in the southern and central Sierra Nevada from usually around 5% to as much as 100% mortality in this last year. And this has in turn worsened forest fires. The higher temperatures, the low soil moisture, and more dead trees have contributed to some of the worst and most expensive forest fires in California over the last 2 years. And finally, we've seen increased groundwater well drilling and pumping, leading to lower and lower groundwater levels. So while it's unwise for anyone to try to predict whether the next water year will be wet or dry, we know that these types of conditions will become more prevalent in the future. And so we should consider treating drought not only as an emergency, but as a new normal. And I'm going to pass it over to Laurel to talk about how this new normal is impacting communities.
Thank you. My name is Laurel Firestone, and I've worked with some of the hundreds of communities and residents in California that don't have access to safe drinking water every day. While 95% of communities have safe water from the tap, many of the smallest water systems in both urban but predominantly rural communities have to worry about how to access safe water in their homes, schools, and at work, and in community spaces. It may be surprising to some to hear that even before the drought, over 296 communities and schools lacked access to safe drinking water in California because of dilapidated infrastructure and contaminated drinking water sources. These communities are found in nearly every county of the state, but the vast majority are in the San Joaquin Valley. Many more households on private wells and communities without a centralized water system, so smaller than 15 connections, are not regulated by the state and therefore are not counted in this number. So the impacts are really even higher. And we estimate that approximately 1 million Californians lack reliable access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water each year. The most common contaminants other than bacterial problems are arsenic and nitrate. And studies at the UC Berkeley found that drinking water with these contaminants are disproportionately found in low-income and Latino communities. So similar to Flint, it is low-income communities and communities of color that bear the brunt of the drinking water crisis here in our state in California. Now with the drought, these same communities are on the front lines of climate change and extreme weather and have been hit hardest by water scarcity. In particular, the most vulnerable have been those without a centralized water system and the communities with only 1 or 2 wells in areas of intensified and unregulated groundwater pumping, mostly to meet the needs of agriculture. Already thousands of families have lost their water supply entirely, and many more communities have lost water supply and have had to turn to more contaminated sources, resulting in unsafe water. What has this all meant for local residents? So many residents already spend anywhere between 4 and 10% of their household income on drinking water alone. These are some of our lowest income residents, and many are forced to look for make hard choices in their budgets in terms of spending spending money on drinking water or other basic needs. We've also found that even though most residents often are not drinking water from the tap, they're often still exposed through using the water for cooking, to make beverages and ice, and therefore are still exposed to the contamination, even though they don't drink glasses of water directly. And many others are turning to other cheaper sugar-sweetened beverages that also increase the other health challenges that are disproportionately found in these communities. Drought in particular has resulted in even more dramatic effects on everyday life. So, residents have had to spend hundreds of dollars to wash their clothes at a laundromat and on paper goods to avoid washing dishes since they have no water. Mothers who normally take pride in their cooking now rely on canned and fast food because washing vegetables uses too much water. We're having to shower in emergency public showers in church parking lots still. So many families, it's over 2 years now. There's really severe mental health impacts that are very widespread, and many farm worker families have seen a decrease in hours and shifts that although ag profits have seemed to be at some record levels, there's been really extreme impacts to the daily lives of farm worker families. The drought response was very informative, I think, in understanding the real costs of responding to water scarcity, which will, again, only be increasing in the future. California has already spent $148 million in Tulare County alone, so in one of the hardest hit counties, for both emergency response like bottled water deliveries, as well as implementing long-term solutions like replacing wells and connecting systems to neighboring systems. But much of the relief hasn't actually was not able to get to residents fast enough, and in some of the worst moments of the drought, there's a snapshot here of the 2015 emergency response, and there were huge percentages of families that were not able to access much of the emergency response for over a year, and about 10% of those without water still haven't been able to. East Porterville is one of the ones where there's been the most media attention. There's thousands of residents that lost water entirely and really relied on, this is a picture of water tanks from a local charity. It was very slow, again, to get state emergency response out. And we still have households where, especially that are not owner-occupied, where tenants have been without running water for more than 2 years. It took even longer to get a permanent solution started for the community, but after about 2 years, and a lot of community advocacy and organizing at the local and state level, we now have started hooking up and have a number of homes already connected to the nearby city of Porterville, and have secured significant funding in the state budget for them to do that. And on the good side, after decades without safe water in the midst of the drought, Seville had been on a waiting list for funding for many years. When their well, to replace their contaminated well, when their well started to decrease, they finally got a new well in the fall of 2014 because they qualified for emergency funding and were able to access funding very quickly. And this meant that it was the first time that the community and the local elementary school that's connected to that system and community had safe drinking water for the first time in over a decade. Unfortunately, last year, so a year later, that new well supply began to falter and actually went out entirely, and which meant that the community and school once again were having to rely on bottled water. And this was due to a number of things, including the lack of any regulation or control actions in terms of local groundwater pumping and management, and the lack of meters on local residents. And so the system didn't have these basic tools needed to sustainably manage water supply generally in that region, and then even more specifically water delivery and use. And so they've now got that back. They continue to have low pressure and bottled and be on a boiled water notice, but they've and they continue to be waiting for implementation through the county of meters and improvements in the leaky distribution system. So the Community Water Center focuses on ensuring that our state's most impacted communities are driving the decision making that affects them through organizing, education, and advocacy, because we really believe that community power and engaged leadership around 3 core issues are necessary to secure the human right to water. The first being that we need to protect and sustainably manage our groundwater supply and our drinking water sources to ensure a safe and reliable water supply. This is true not just for the environmental justice and small and low-income communities, but really is true for all of us in California. Funding access is another area that is needed to ensure that all systems can access adequate financing for adequate infrastructure while maintaining affordable water rates. And there's a number of opportunities and challenges that both the local and state level to address funding access needs that we're working on. And then supporting institutional capacity and scale to ensure that the technical, managerial, and financial capacity of drinking water providers and water management agencies are able to provide the services that are needed to support local communities and population. So a lot of this means looking at creating economies of scale where systems may be managed regionally, may consolidate, interconnect, and have more diversified sources, so there's increased resiliency. And together we believe all 3 are necessary to ensure reliable access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water, and ultimately secure what California adopted in 2012 as the human right to water. As a state, we have seen major policy advances especially in this area of drinking water just in the past few years. In 2012, we were the first state in the country to adopt a Human Right to Water Act, where we've basically enshrines it as a policy of the state and really directs state agencies within all of their regulatory, grant, and other administrative programs to be looking explicitly at how they can be advancing, ensuring that all residents have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water, as well as basic sanitation services. Proposition 1 in the water bond, which we'll mention later, had an unprecedented level of money specifically for small disadvantaged communities, and a huge amount of that for technical assistance. All past bonds had really passed by some of the communities that hadn't been shovel ready because they couldn't finance the planning studies necessary to be able to qualify for funding. And so one of the great advances I think in Prop 1 is I think it's up to $78 million in technical assistance and planning support to really work directly with these communities and make sure they're developing the best solutions that are truly sustainable and able to access the funding that we have as a state. There's a number of institutional things, including this new Office of Sustainable Water Solutions that was developed that's housing this new technical assistance program. And then extremely, and then one of really I think the most important policy advancements was adoption of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. This was for the first time setting a framework for requiring sustainability within our management of groundwater supplies. It still relies on local agencies and really emphasizes collaboration in developing local plans, but it also says that it has to meet sustainability targets, and I know there'll be more discussion of this. But one challenge has been that because this is a brand new act, there's a lot that in the meantime, as local agencies are forming and developing plans, we are still seeing unprecedented levels of new wells and pumping in areas. And so places like Seville won't see immediate relief from that for a while to come. However, it does give us hope that we're finally really getting our heads around how we're going to be managing this for the long term. And then the other significant one is really around consolidation power. So for the first time, California has recognized that throughout its financial programs, it really needs to promote and incentivize consolidation where feasible so that there's less reliance on these small systems that really are the most vulnerable to increased water shortages and have had the most challenges providing safe water. And there's even powers in some cases to force neighboring cities to take on failing systems nearby when that's the only feasible option to ensure the community has safe drinking water.
Thanks, Laurel. And I'll add on that we've continued on that path in 2016 with some other major policy victories. 2 UCS-sponsored bills were passed in this legislative session, which ended in September. AB 2800 was the Climate Safe Infrastructure Bill, and that requires state engineers for the first time to work with climate scientists more closely to determine how engineering design specifications need to change to better incorporate climate science. And SB 1425 was a water energy registry, which creates the first voluntary registry for water suppliers to track and report the energy and greenhouse gas emissions associated with their water services. The Community Water Center was actively involved in shaping SB 1263, so I'll let you talk about that, Laurel.
Yeah, so one of the things that's needed is to get ahead of the curve and stop permitting new small water systems when there's or private well communities that are the most vulnerable, so we're not creating more problems. And so this bill ensures that new developments, for one, can't rely on things like hauled water as their water supply for new development, which seems like a no-brainer, but needed to be enshrined because there were proposals for that. And secondly, that all new systems need to be able to show technical, managerial, financial capacity and go through a process with the State Water Board to get permits so that we can curb proliferation of small, unsustainable systems without the resiliency needed for our future. And then lastly, a major advance is Executive Order B 3716, Making Conservation a Way of Life, which had a variety of of aspects, but was really about trying to enshrine conservation standards and targets for both urban and, well, particularly for urban water users, and drought and water supply contingency planning and analysis for urban and agricultural plans. And so this really sets out development of a whole new framework to make conservation a way of life throughout water uses in California. It's just starting and will result in is a collaboration between many different agencies throughout the state, and a report is expected in January from the initial framework for how that will move forward. But there's still more work to do.
You might remember the water bond that was passed in 2014. There were ads running with Governor Brown talking about Proposition 1 being the water bond. And this year the state is writing the rules that will govern how a large chunk of that $7.5 billion water bond will be spent. The water bond is really a once-in-a-generation opportunity to redesign the state's water system to respond to all of these water challenges that we've been discussing today. The largest pot of funds, almost $3 billion, was reserved for new water storage infrastructure in the bond. And the California Water Commission is currently developing the criteria that will be used to determine how that money gets spent. These funds were meant to support new above ground storage like the picture seen here, but also below ground storage. And these systems are supposed to last for decades, if not over a century, when the effects of climate change will be even more severe than they are now. And yet initial drafts of the regulations didn't include any reference to climate change. Thanks in part to the action of our members at UCS, who over 4,000 of them wrote into the California Water Commission, thank you. The revised regulations did include analyzing the impact of climate change on water projects at 2 points in time in 2030 and 2070. And while this wasn't a perfect solution, it was a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, at yesterday's California Water Commission meeting, there was a lot of pressure to backslide and only require an analysis out to 2030, which would essentially delete more than 50 years of climate science data. This is just one example of how we need to continue to communicate why and how to use climate science appropriately so we don't invest in projects that won't deliver benefits in the future. And when there are important public policy issues like these decisions, you can get involved. And we'd love to have you join our Action Network or our Science Network at the top link on this slide, which is ucsusa.org/groundwater. In addition, as Laurel mentioned, this year and next, groundwater sustainability agencies are forming. And they are the entities that will implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, the first regulation of the state's groundwater. You can find out if there's one of these agencies in your area at the second link. This is a map that you can click on, and you can contact them and ask to join their interested persons list, which means that you will be kept update on their activities. If there's no groundwater sustainability agency listed in your area yet, you could contact your county. You can also look at the third link, which is a great new website that is compiling resources to participate more closely in groundwater planning and to have the information to engage with the groundwater sustainability agencies as they form or once they're formed. That's cagroundwater.org. And finally, you can join the movement for water justice that Laurel describes in detail at www.communitywatercenter.org/join. And finally, we have been running a tipping points blog series. And a tipping point is defined as the critical point in a process or system beyond which a significant and often unstoppable change takes place. We think that many of the decisions we're making now are going to affect our water system for decades to come. We're blogging about these issues, many of the issues we've discussed today and more on our Tipping Points blog series. This is a really new communication tool that will provide you with time-sensitive alerts and information as critical decision points approach. And we'll also be posting a recording of this webinar there. So you can sign up to automatically receive the Tipping Points series at the address listed at the bottom of this slide. We really want to thank you for joining us today. We're going to leave a lot of time for questions because we usually have a lot of questions. We are really looking forward to tipping the scales in favor of science and democracy with you, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Great, thanks to our presenters. And now we'll start the Q&A portion. So if you have a question for either of our speakers, go ahead and type it into the chat box. We may not be able to get to everyone, but we will. I'll provide my email for to collect questions if they don't get answered during this webinar. And just to answer, I think some people have asked this in the question. Juliet just said this, but this webinar will be posted to the Tipping Points blog series. So if you subscribe to that, you will get a notification when it goes up online. So the first question is for Laurel, and it is how much of the problems in the Central Valley are due to lack of water, and how much is it the quality of the available water?
Yeah, well, the two are definitely related. In terms of the number of people and communities without water at all versus those with contaminated water, there's drastically more numbers and communities with contaminated water than those without water at all. However, many communities like Poplar, for example, have seen their wells and water supplies decrease and then had to turn to backup wells, which are often contaminated. And so as water levels have decreased, they've had an increasing contaminated supply and had more challenges with contamination. You know, one of the I think important but often overlooked things about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is that it looks actually at all of these things, not just supply, but also other what they term undesirable results, including water quality contamination, saltwater intrusion, especially in coastal areas, subsidence, and impacts on groundwater-dependent ecosystems.
Great, thanks. So the next question is about Prop 1. So Juliet, maybe you want to take this one. Since Prop 1 has a goal of increasing storage, how can we make sure that groundwater storage is, getting funded through that process and is a focus of that process as, in addition to or as opposed to above ground storage?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we've been focused on at this point is really trying to develop fair criteria that don't bias the funding decisions based on whether the storage projects are above ground or below ground. And we really want to have a set of criteria that choose projects that are cost effective, that are climate resilient, and will continue to function in drier dry periods, longer dry periods, and some wetter wet periods as well. And when you look at the way the system is changing, already seeing snow melt peaking about a month earlier, the traditional reservoir-dominated system is not well suited to some of the longer and more severe droughts that we're having and to the shift from snow to rain. So what we need to do is really increase the flexibility of our system and and really look at the groundwater storage as a big part of the solution, since we just simply don't even have the space or the sites to build dams that could contain the amount of water that will now be liquid rather than in snowpack. And the process of looking at these sites and trying to move funding into looking at how to store groundwater is it's going to be a long process, because we have a system that's really up until recently been focused on above ground storage and surface streams and surface water rights. So as Laurel was saying, we don't even have a well-developed rights system around groundwater, and we don't have an allocation system, and we haven't even understood where wells were drilled or how deep they were until very recently. And that's another one of the victories, is that well permits, well log permits have actually become public for the first time, and they will be available, I hope soon, on the Department of Water Resources website that describe where wells are drilled and how deep they are, so that we can just start to get an understanding of the consumption side of groundwater. Laurel, do you want to add on to that at all?
I mean, I think data and transparency are key to ensuring that this is actually effective and we really meet our targets. And I think is something that's really been missing. And as I mentioned, this goes both for the agricultural sector, which uses by far the most amount of water in the Central Valley, but also even on the urban side and for water providers, making sure that we all have the tools to measure their water use so that we can manage it effectively. And I know there's been some questions about water use, and I wanted to just go a little bit more into the executive order that was issued around making conservation a way of life. There's actually a huge amount in that. One was really around using water more wisely, and so that's, in the drought, the State Water Board had a mandatory reduction across the board for all urban water agencies. They're now have eased that, and unfortunately there's been less conservation happening, but instead are really focusing on making more permanent, developed targets and standards for urban water agencies to make conservation a more permanent requirement, and tailored to indoor residential use, outdoor irrigation, commercial, industrial, and institutional use, and also water loss through leaks through distribution systems. There's also a number of provisions around eliminating water waste, and so that includes permanently prohibiting practices like things like hosing off sidewalks, washing automobiles without shut-off nozzles, non-recirculating fountains, or lawns that cause runoff, those sorts of things, irrigating turf on public streets. But also around minimizing waste from leaks, and accelerating data collection and improved management, also in both urban and agricultural sectors, as well as through the Energy Commission certification of technology around conservation and water loss detection and control technologies. And that also is linked with increasing energy efficiency, since water is one of the highest, moving water is one of our highest energy uses in the state. There's also a number of things around strengthening local drought resiliency and improving agricultural water use efficiency and drought planning. And so there's development for the first time of water shortage contingency plans and agricultural water management plans that are well beyond at least hopefully, with the finals of what those look like haven't been developed yet, but the direction is to have those be much more substantial than what's been there in the past. So, I think the state is recognizing, and this executive order in particular is recognizing that we have to be conserving across the board if we're going to be able to do this. But to be able to manage our water supply and provide basic needs for our lives and economy, as with increasing climate change, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Great, thanks. So I know you guys both touched on this in the last answer, but there's a question about what progress has been made to monitor groundwater consumption. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, that would be great.
Sure. There's a lot of questions. Sorry, I'm scrolling through them a little bit. The water data, we do have an outdated water data collection and management system, and if you contrast it to energy data as one of our questions proposed, it's a totally different ballgame. So when we talk about energy data, you all should be getting basically like nutritional labels. They're required by the California Energy Commission, and it's information about all of the different energy sources that are going into your power mix that you're using in your homes, and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with that, and the quantity of energy that's being used. And obviously you have metered energy use within your home, and you know how much you use, and in many places your bills explain how much you use compared to other people who live near you. In the water world, we still have a lot of systems, as Laurel described, that don't even have meters. So if you don't have a meter that's telling you how much water you're using, you don't have much of an incentive to change your behavior. In addition, there's not a real price signal that's being transmitted that says that water is valuable and that the more you use, the more you pay. But beyond the local metering situation, when we get to groundwater, in most places that information has been completely private. There has been no public data, and that's one of the things with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act where this information will start to be compiled at the local level. It won't be specific to specific users. It will be anonymized and it will be aggregated at a higher level. But every year, every single groundwater sustainability agency will be reporting on the amount of groundwater that's being used and different types of uses. So we'll start to get some information about groundwater use, and we'll also start to get some information about groundwater levels, the elevations, and tracking that over time. Until now, we've been really reliant on a pretty limited set of monitoring wells that the state and federal government keeps up to date. And also we've been using a lot of satellite measurements. Because we don't have those localized measurements in most places, the satellite data has been measuring the change in the Earth's gravitational pull. And that information is actually showing us that the Central Valley is one of the areas where we are pumping out groundwater the fastest in the world. We're in the top 3. So all of this information that will be collected due to these new laws is very important, but we also need an information infrastructure to ensure that people can access that information and use it to ask questions. And that's been another challenge, is that a lot of this has been done through paper record keeping. And there's files cabinets full of information, but you actually have to go in person to get that information. What we're trying to do with our allies is ask for more electronic submission so that data can be readily available, that people can download it online and start to look at some of the trends. And we were part of a bill that helped move us in that direction today, in that direction this year, called AB 1755, which is the Open Water Data and Transparency Act, and that is going to require the Department of Water Resources to start providing more electronic access to some of their data sets that they have within their buildings in Sacramento.
Great. So we've had quite a few questions about bottled water companies, water-for-profit companies, and their effect on groundwater levels and groundwater quality, and also around what sort of regulatory or just public pressure points there may be to affect that. So Laurel, if you wanted to address that.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of questions, so I probably won't be able to answer all of the detailed questions on this, so feel free to write more follow-up. But so it's interesting because a huge millions of dollars in drought response funding has been for bottled water deliveries and for communities without access to water for their basic needs, and that is really important. And so we have relied and needed access to water for those communities. And it was also interesting as that was really just for domestic needs, or for consumption needs. But some of the other drought response was for tanked water, which was non-potable and needed a water source, and or it was actually supposed to be potable water. However, they couldn't guarantee that by the time it got into the house from the tanks it was going to be potable, and so they had a really hard time getting water supplies from any of the neighboring communities' tap water systems, and were able, in some cases, had to drill a whole new well just to meet those emergency needs for hauled water. So on one hand, there's a need to be able to respond to these sorts of emergency needs, and there is a lot of money, public money, being spent on that is paying bottled water companies. I know there's been a number of cases, both that are happening with Nestle and others throughout different parts of the state, and especially in mountain communities, and there's big fights and struggles to either curb or prevent new extraction or expanded extraction happening. Overall, there's also many bottled water companies that use municipal supplies, so are within an urban water system and are just an industrial user of that urban water system supplies. So when the drought cutbacks happened and public water systems, the urban water systems, had to reduce their use by, say, 25 to 35%. They really went to all of their industries, including the bottled water companies, and had to push across the board for decreased supplies. That really applied for those bottled water companies that were in urban areas or on an urban water system. But many of these areas, like Nestle, and I know there's some in Siskiyou County that are not are tapping into springs. Those really, I think, have been left out of effective regulatory programs, and I think unfortunately, even with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, because they're not in priority basins, they're often in mountains and springs that are not well documented or regulated. They really haven't been effectively controlled and rely on a challenge between federal, state, and local jurisdictions, and I think often fall through the cracks. Related questions, although a whole different area around fracking, is there, in the San Joaquin, especially in Kern County and other parts of the state, but in the southern San Joaquin Valley, there is extensive fracking going on. It uses a huge amount of water. But it also produces, it creates a huge amount of wastewater that comes up with the extraction. And there's been a lot of challenges and new efforts to start to regulate that much further. It's through, there is a separate regulatory program for that, but it also will become more and will be integrated in terms of the water use under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, to the extent that they're using groundwater to do the fracking. That won't regulate the wastewater that comes up with the when fracking occurs. But many growers in the area in particular are using wastewater or are using different forms of water to apply on crops as everyone in the basin is looking for the cheapest and most available water supplies. And so I know that is a big concern and challenge, and one that I think both the public and the state are need to be pressuring and grappling with.
Thanks. So before the end of the hour, I did say we would check the phones. So let's hear, are there any questions from people on the phones?
And ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press star followed by the number 1 on your telephone keypad. And if your question has been answered and you would like to withdraw it, please press the pound key. And there are no questions at this time.
Okay, so in our last couple minutes here, we had a question about we actually had a couple questions about this. So I'll just read one of them. And I think, Juliet, probably this is for you, although Laurel, if you have something to add, please do. So what is the role of California's outdated data collection and management infrastructure in improvising resiliency in the face of climate change impacts? And has UCS made any recommendations or compiled any reports on this subject?
Yes, thank you. There is a lack of data around many of the questions people are asking. And fracking is one of them that's coming up, and there's just recently been the first reports coming out of Fran Pavley's legislation to start monitoring the impact of fracking on our water resources. So when we are looking towards the future, what we really need in order to make any claims and any arguments that science could be useful is we need to have some data that can show policymakers and people who at the end of the day have to believe that public funding should support science and data. We have to show them why it can help us better manage the system. And so much of what we're trying to do is take a lot of the academic information that's being compiled around how climate change is affecting our water system, and find the people who are conducting the research and talk with them. In some cases, train them in talking to policymakers, and in other cases, serve as the conduit to bring the information that's being put together by scientists to the policy decisions that are being made right now. And for instance, we're working to describe why climate change is an important thing to consider when we're funding water projects out to the end of the century with the California Water Commission. And even though I think that makes sense at a theoretical level, actually operationalizing it is difficult. And so we submit comment letters every couple of months, and we attend all of the meetings, and we are there to advocate for science and to advocate for better information to actually inform our decision making in Sacramento. So one of the reports we wrote about this was called Measuring What Matters, and that was really about how to design effective, sustainable groundwater management systems. We also wrote a report in conjunction with the Community Water Center called Collaborating for Success. And that was about the social science of actually interacting with communities, with counties, with land use authorities to manage the shared groundwater that's underneath all of our cities and towns and farms. And the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act for the first time requires these agencies to interact with land management authorities, these water agencies, and also requires them to interact with more stakeholders. They are required to reach out to a diverse set of economic, political, and social stakeholders representing different interest areas. And how do you do that effectively? So, we've been trying to create tools and resources for policymakers to put together policies that will serve current and future generations.
Great. Well, thank you to our speakers and to all of you for your participation today. As I mentioned before, if you subscribe to the Tipping Points blog series, which the link is in the chat box, you'll receive a notification when the recording of this webinar is put up online. I hope you found this informative and helpful as we move forward to incorporate climate science into water policy decisions. Thank you again to our speakers for joining us today. Have a nice rest of your day.